Hey there, I'm Geuer-Pollmann from the Azure Fast Track for ISV team in Germany, and today we are walking through a scenario where an ISV, a software company which is described on the right hand side, wants to effectively create snapshots or provide services to customers here. The customers are running infrastructure as a service virtual machines, and the ISV basically wants to be able to create a snapshot from a running VM, from the disk of a running VM, transfer that snapshot over into a subscription on the ISV side, and mount it over there as a data disk. And we are looking into this currently in this video from the perspective of a non-encrypted disk, or of a disk which is only encrypted using platform keys, not using customer managed keys. So the overall setup and flow through which we will go is, first we will create a so-called multi-tenanted application here in our scenario, which is this yellow component over here. For the multi-tenanted application, we will also create a so-called service principal. So let's just highlight these things. So we will create a service principal on the ISV tenant, so we can programmatically kind of trigger a whole bunch of operations. And we will create a resource group over here in which our scanner virtual machine, so this here is our scanner VM, will be running later. And what the customer does is the customer effectively installs our multi-tenanted application on their side of the house as well. So in our scenario here, we are basically creating this green service principal which corresponds to our multi-tenanted application. And we will be giving that service principal the capability to create disk snapshots at the subscription, or maybe even at the management group level. So after this setup, we will then trigger a snapshot and show how the application, how the ISV can basically use these two service principals to copy the snapshot from the ISV side of the house after we created it into a disk at the ISV side in the scanner resource group, and then basically mounting it to a VM as a data disk and having fun with that disk. So this is the plan for today's session. In order to highlight, or in order to demonstrate this, we are basically doing a full live walkthrough, so to say, from zero to hero. And we will be having a couple of environments. So the first environment is the ISV environment over here, for which I'm using the Geuer-Pollmann DE tenant. The customer I am simulating from the customer tenant over here, from chgoer FTE. And we also have different subscriptions. The plan is basically to do this in the Western Europe region. For the whole purpose of this demo, I want to do everything purely script based. So basically, whenever I encounter something over here, basically executing these commands in the shell, executing all of these commands step by step in the shell below. So also let's have a quick look on the setup. So as customer, I have a customer resource group. And in the customer resource group, there is a customer VM running. So let's just have a quick look at this VM. So the VM is running here on an IP address. It is running in the Western Europe data center. So let's just, for the sake of the experiment, quickly... No, I don't want .NET Interactive here. What's going on? I don't want all that. Let's quickly SSH into this machine, and let's see where we are. So in good security practice, I become admin. I have a look over here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And we want to touch a file over here. So let's say 2020 08 15 dash current time dot 00. -00.text. So we now have this file basically as a proof, like this is our live volume at the customer side. So let's exit this VM and run our setup environment. So in the Western Europe location, first of all, let's just remember all of the different ISV variables and the customer variables here, like subscription ID, tenant ID, and resource group names. First, I want to create a multi-tenanted application on the ISV side. And by the way, I will be remembering a password for the ISV application basically in my local file system, which is really good security practice, but works for our current demo. So phase number one, we want to configure the identity side of the house. So first, let's log in using the AZ command line into the ISV tenant. So this on my laptop, this just pops up this is a one-time setup, right? So it pops up a browser. The ISV is Christian at Geuer-Pollmann.de. Thanks for logging in. So we are now signed in over here. Let's make sure we use also our right subscription. And let's quickly demonstrate the subscription in which we are in, which should be the CH-Geuer MSDN subscription. This is my simulated ISV. So first step, we create a multi-tenanted application over here. So by running this command, this under the hood connects to the Microsoft Graph API, and you see it supplies a sign-in audience of Azure AD multiple organizations, multiple orgs. This is what Microsoft calls a multi-tenanted application. So first, let's just have a quick look at the ISV side into our Azure AD. So inside my app registrations, somewhere, somehow, I should now be, or is it in enterprise applications? I'm always mixing these things up. Let's just have a look at all of the applications I have. Let's sort them by the creation date. And it now gives me the oldest one, so now the newest one. Why don't I see anything here? That is not a good demo, so to say. Let's just echo what the JSON what we got back from here. Echo this one, and let's pipe this into JQ. Okay, so it seems it has been created, but let's just refresh this. Maybe I'm just doing something wrong, or I'm again looking at the wrong spot. Let's bump it up a level, go to, I'm looking at the right tenant. So app registrations. Oh, okay, there was just some delay until it became visible. So here we are. Here we have our Geuer-Pollmann.de multi-tenant application for mounting disks in a different tenant. So this is now, up until now, just our enterprise application. So here we are now remembering the object ID and the application ID in shell variables. And let's create a service principal. So the Azure AD service principal create command basically creates a service principal for this multi-tenanted application. So that step basically created. Now we have, let's just mark them all in green. So now, or now we have this multi-tenanted application, and we have the service principal existing on the ISV side. So this is the step until now. Let's actually also give this service principal a credential so we can get tokens for it. First, we remember the service principal ID, and let's just print out all these values. So now we can see the object ID and the application ID of our multi-tenanted application are these two, and the ID of the service principal is this one. Next step, by the way, because we want this service principal to be able to manage this resource group, let's create the resource group at the ISV side. So AZ group creates the underlying, scanning demo ISV side resource group. And let's give our service principal contributor rights on that resource group. So this is the well-known ID for the contributor role. And now we are just going to execute the AZ role assignment create command. And this basically gives the given service principal with the service principal ID contributor rights on the ISV resource group. We can just check this if we are in the mood to do so by going to the ISV tenant into our resource groups. Here we have our scanning resource group, and in the access control panel in the role assignments, we should now be seeing a contributor assignment. So here the Geuer-Pollmann DE multi-tenant app is contributor at the ISV side. So basically now we have this baby here existent as well. So and the service principal can manage this contributor rights. Actually, we also now just grab quickly an access token for the graph API, and we run a quick command in which we create a password which is valid for 1 year. So here, let's just echo this for a minute. Oops. And a quote. So here we see there's a demo credential from today until 1 year down the road. So we are now going to create this service principal, and we extract the secret, the password basically out of the response, and we store it in our local file so we can use it. So effectively in my home directory, there is this principal for an unencrypted disk access. So now we have our service principal token. Let's just check if we can interactively, or well, programmatically actually, get an access token for that service principal. So for the multi-tenanted application, with our password from the passwords file, we grab a token for the ISV tenant. And let's just, for fun, basically output some comments or some contents of this token. So we can see 5F9 something, this is the ISV tenant, and the application and the service principal. So this is basically, we are now able to get access tokens for this service principal or here on the ISV side of the house. Let's also, because like at the point in time when we need to copy this snapshot over to the ISV side, we do not want to handle and work with shared access signatures and, you know, dealing with storage and doing all these weird things. We want to directly do the full Azure Active Directory based authentication, and therefore we need to register both the ISV subscription as well as the customer subscription to be able to use this feature. So this means we run the AZ feature register command for the Microsoft Compute allow Azure AD auth for data access feature. This is, if you haven't run this, it might take up to half an hour or 20 minutes until this is done. The AZ feature quickly shows you where you are with this feature. So here you can see, like, it gives me back a property state registered, so I can use that feature on the ISV side of the house. Next step, we now head over to the ISV side of the house and set up things over there as well. So we interactively, or we enable our shell session to pretend to be the ISV. This happens using a different identity, using my corporate credential over here. So we are now signed in to the other Azure AD tenant. So let's just quickly look at what we're looking at here. So now we are operating in the CH Geuer work subscription, and which is our presumed customer. Also here we would need to enable this feature, or just for the sake of the experiment, just validate that it is already enabled. So property state should give me a registered here, and that's cool. There is a whole bunch of conversations around what is the best way to install the ISV application in the customer tenant, or how to properly authorize the ISV to manage things at the customer side. This is a separate conversation. For the time being, let's just say somebody who is a global administrator or an application administrator on the customer side manually or via a script installs the ISV application into the customer tenant. So now we are running the service principal create command at the customer side after we signed in. So let's run this whole command. So, and let's just remember a couple of properties and print them out. So these IDs now belong to the corresponding service principal at the customer tenant side. So now this multi-tenant application is represented as a service principal at the customer side. So next step is we need to figure out what permissions we want to grant, the customer wants to grant us. So for sure, we need disk snapshot contributor permissions, because right here then basically this service principal will have to create a snapshot from an existing disk. So this is the minimum we need for the current situation. Then we can figure out, do we want to give ourselves these disk snapshot contributor privileges at the subscription level, or maybe even very bold, for example, at the management group, like the tenant root management group. Effectively, like, let's just have a look here in our customer resource group. Here's the customer resource group. And let's just go into the access control here and see what existing access existing accesses exist. Let me just collapse all of these. As you can see, like, there is no dedicated like snapshot creator stuff. I can also go into the management groups and have a look here. So here you see that this is a subscription. The Geuer work customer subscription lives in the tenant root group. So what I now do is I grant the ISV's application access both to the subscription but also at the tenant root group level. So let's just do this for a minute. So we remember the well-known ID for disk snapshot contributor, and we run it on a scope of the subscription. So after this command, we will see inside the resource group's access control permissions in the IAM tab in the role assignments that the multi-tenanted application has disk snapshot contributor permissions, and this permission comes in because the resource group inherits it from the subscription. So now we are ready to go. If a customer would do this differently, you could, for example, also a customer could decide to do this at the management group level. So, for example, in this case, I'm going really bold, and the tenant root is basically equal to the Azure AD customer tenant ID. So here, I'm giving it now really full-blown permissions across all subscriptions. So when I reload this, you can see that these permissions come in both via the management group and the subscription. So now we are actually ready to rock and do something. So last thing, because we do not have virtual machine contributor rights, we only have the right to create snapshots. We somehow need to learn about the ID of a disk. So in my case now, I will just have a look at the resource group. So the name of the VM is customer-VM. So the resource group, the resource ID is this one, right? So in the customer subscription, in the customer resource group, the customer VM is the one which we want to snapshot. So now I retrieve the virtual machine's JSON description. I go into the property storage profile OS disk and grab me the resource ID of the managed disk. So the disk which we want to snapshot here, compute disk, is customer VM OS disk gobbledygook something. So this information about which disk to snapshot needs to come from somewhere. Cool. Now that we have this information, we are ready to start with the automatable part of our environment. So we now use our service principal and our multi-tenanted application basically to sign in and get privileges on the customer tenant. Okay? So here we interactively sign in to the customer tenant. Let's actually grab an access token and show some of the contents in this access token. So, and this is now, let's run it again. Let's run this again. So here the identity provider of this access token is 94 something. And if I scroll back up, this is the customer tenant. So the customer tenant basically issued us a token to do stuff on the customer side. So let me find out where I left off. Permissions. Where did we get our token? Here. Here's our service principal token. So the first thing is now, so the next step is we now want to trigger the snapshot operation. So this service principal here, or the multi-tenant application with the service principal, wants to trigger a snapshot creation for a given disk. So in this case, let's just name that snapshot based on the VM name and the timestamp. And this is the body of our call. So let's just go in here a bit. And let's just have a look at what this call will request. It will basically say, please take the operating system disk from over here and create a snapshot. And by the way, this is the reason why we turned on these feature previews. We want to authenticate using Azure AD to the snapshot creation process. So the snapshot resource ID is this one. And now we just trigger the snapshot operation. So we basically make a put against the snapshot. And there we go. So let's just navigate here and refresh our view. Okay, so there is, maybe it's not yet visible, but doesn't matter. Let's just retrieve the information using the AZ command line. Let's just have a look at all the snapshots in that resource group. If the portal is not yet there, the API for sure is. So here we have our snapshot. Or if we want to have the details of this snapshot, let's just get the JSON description of that snapshot in more detail. So we can see this is in standard zone redundant storage across all zones in the Western Europe region. Here's the name, Western Europe, blah, 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 blah. That's our thing, right? So after we, and let's just validate that the snapshot is there. Also, you can see it in here. There's our snapshot. Cool. So now we created the snapshot on the left side of the house. And we now want to transfer the snapshot to become a data disk at the ISV side of the house. And there's a typo. This is the ISV resource group, of course. So we now want to do this transfer operation. This is a little bit tricky in the sense that you need to be able to prove that you're authorized to read the snapshot over here And you need to be able to prove that that you are able to authorize to create a disk over here. And the problem is reading requires an access token from the customer tenant, and creation here requires an access token from the ISV tenant. So how does this go? Effectively, we need to put two tokens for the same application into our API call. And this is what's happening in the next step. So let's just use plain curl to grab an access token for the customer side for our service principal. Let's grab a token for the ISV side. So in both cases, you effectively see like I'm specifying the service principal for the customer and the multi-tenanted up ID on the ISV side. In both cases, I'm supplying the same password. I'm saying I want a token for the management API. But in this case, I am asking the customer Azure AD tenant. In the second case, I am asking the ISV Azure AD tenant to generate these tokens. So these two JSON tokens should have claims with different issue attributes, but with the same application ID. So let's just print out that information and scroll up here a bit. Let's just run the same thing again. So here our customer side token is issued by the customer Azure AD tenant. Our ISV token is issued by the ISV, but both have the same application ID and both are valid to be used with the Azure Management API. So now we have two valid access tokens on our hands. Now, just pick a name for the disk, and so the resource ID of the disk is now, of course, in the ISV subscription here. So this basically is the fully qualified ID of the disk on the ISV side. Now we are creating the body for our call, in which we say, hey, I want to create a disk and please copy it from a snapshot at the customer side in the Western Europe location. And you need to keep one thing in mind. Now you need to figure out which zone you want to create the disk in, because a disk is in exactly one zone. The snapshot is not a problem, but for the disk you now need to say in which zone to materialize this disk, because you have to create the VM in the very same zone. So, and now comes the trick which I mentioned earlier. We need to supply both tokens. So what we do in our authorization header, we put in the token for the ISV side, and there is a mechanism, the X Microsoft Authorization Auxiliary header, which can contain one or even more authorization tokens from other Azure AD tenants. So we basically put the disk, we say copied from the snapshot, and here are two tokens to prove that we are authorized to do whatever we want to do. So, okay, that was quick. Let's just read using the ISV token what happens. So here I'm going to grab the description of the disk from the ISV side, and I want to have a look at a couple of properties of this disk. So let's try that command here. Wham bam. So the source of this was a snapshot in the customer resource group. The ID of a disk is in the ISV subscription. It succeeded. It's, for good reasons, not yet attached to any VM. It is encrypted with a platform key, and we have been doing that with the Azure Active Directory authentication mechanism feature, and the availability zone in which that disk lives is AZ1. So now we have that information, and that's pretty much it. So let's, just for the sake of the argument, demonstrate that we can do something useful with it. So going to the scanner resource group, and here our disk showed up. Now let's create a virtual machine. Virtual machine. For example, here. Let's create one. Let's pick a generation 1 VM here. Scanner is our VM. We want to be in Western Europe in availability zone 1. We have to be in order to mount the disk. We want a secure shell in with that name, and we want to use an existing public key, and I can't remember my own public key, so .ssh id pub. Let's just take this one here. Let's go to the disk portion, and let's attach an existing disk. So here, I hope it shows up. Yeah, here our disk shows up, locally redundant storage something. And we are now ready to rock and yeah, install, spin up the VM. Let's create this machine. And this will take a minute or something. I will pause the video for the time being. So now our VM provisioning is fine. Let's go to the resource, to the VM. It's running an AZ1 in the customer in the ISV subscription. Let's grab the IP address and let's fire off. Yes, sure. And let's go here and let's see what's going on. No, actually, I'm sorry. I'm screwing things up here. Of course, I don't see anything because I didn't mount the data disk. So let's sudo su. So what is the disk which we want to mount? Certainly like this one here. So we want to mount dev SDB1 to data disk. And let's go to data disk. And here we have the file which we touched earlier on, which is our, the file basically from the environment, which we created at the customer side. And that's pretty much the end of the first part of this demo.